So as you know, we have Senator Patrick Brazeau, who's here, flew here from Montreal, well, many of the people who were in the class, they know how this kind of came about. We were having discussions in class. I actually brought up his name. I think I was talking about I don't know more. Anyways, I brought up Patrick's name, and then you put your hand up and said, and Bruce is in the class and said, "That's my cousin." I said, "Oh, okay, cool. That's, you know." And then Bruce said, "Well, can we have him Skype into the class?" And I said, "Sure, of course we can, you know, have Patrick Skype in the class." And then, the next thing you know, it was actually, he was coming here in person.
There you go.
So here we are, you know, a long flight. So do you want to, I know you wanted to say a couple words, because you wanted to open. You've done a lot of planning,
I actually didn't want to say any words, but I've been forced to. First of all, thank you for staying after the break. I know in this class we always lose a few bodies after the break. My name is Bruce Ferguson, and I'm going to acknowledge the Portland people because it's their land, and we always do that. And I'm going to say a few things about my cousin. My grandmother is his grandfather's, or their brother and sister, somewhere in history. And I get lost with all of this stuff. I wanted to say one thing about Patrick, and that is there are two independent Indigenous senators in the Senate. The other one, I forgot his name, but he's got like 3 years left, and Patrick's got like 30 years. So here's a person who is not bound by party politics, can listen to us as Indigenous people, and try his best to get the message in the Senate. Apparently, he tried that on Friday, and we didn't get it, did we? So I will give you to Patrick now, and that's my speech.
Well, hi, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. For those who don't know me, my name is Patrick Brazeau. I'm an Algonquin from Maniwaki, Quebec, which is just a short drive north of our nation's capital, where you know, the games get played. And I would like to acknowledge the Kwantlen people on the traditional territory where we stand on here today to have the fortunate time to meet, and I would like to thank all of you for being here, whether you had to or not. It's just great to be here, and I'd like to thank Lisa for inviting me to be here, and to Bruce Ferguson, which, you know, he didn't mention this, we are cousins, but this is the first time we actually met, so it is a small world, so it's all good. My presentation, I'll try to keep it as short as I possibly could, and I would like to entertain a question and answer period. I like that kind of interaction if possible, and feel free to ask any questions at the end of my presentation. So on the, you know, I have nothing written, I have nothing prepared. You know, each time we get asked to make types of presentations, we think, you know, who the audience will be, what they might like to hear, what they may not like to hear, put things down on paper, but I usually tend to fly by the seat of my pants as much as possible. And I say what I believe in. I'm a person of principle. You may not like what I have to say, you may like what I have to say, but at least one thing you get out of this, and by the way, I'm still Canada's youngest senator, and I turned 43 this past Saturday, so you know, I still brag. I still have the bragging rights on that one. So like I said, you know, just thinking about what I should talk about, and you know, I'm still not sure, but let me give it a shot. Let's talk about politics a little bit. I don't know if anybody out of you are interested in politics or not, but let me say one thing. Politics is dirty. It's sometimes a sham. And maybe sometimes it's organized legal crime. Who knows? When I was asked to come here, I was told that it would be for a criminology class, and I'm like, ooh, You know, with everything that I've been through in the last couple of years, talking about crime, maybe it's not a good idea to show up. But you know what? I've been charged with a lot of things. Let me break the ice. I've been charged with a lot of things. And I was at one point one individual who didn't believe in too much in Canada's justice system. I didn't think there was a justice system. I thought it was a legal system. And what I mean by legal system is that it's all about judges, lawyers, delays, about money, administration. But I went through the justice system, and I believe in the justice system now, because to make a long story short, you know, and it's out there, it's in the media, I was charged with many different things, and I got acquitted of everything. And let me just say from the onset, it's not because, you know, some people believe that, you know, some individuals get off on charges because of high-priced lawyers or connections of who they know. And remember what I just said, money and connections of people you may know. You know, I started my career with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. I was a summer student there, doing research. And this organization is an organization that represented every First Nation, Métis, and Aboriginal person in Canada, but who lived off reserve. Now there's other organizations as well, but the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples was one. And the affiliate here at the time in BC was the United Native Nations, which you probably heard about, but are now a defunct organization. But anyway, I started my career there as a summer student in 2001. Fast forward 2004, I became the vice chief of the organization, an elected position. In 2006, the national chief of that organization. And 2 years after that, 2008, I got a call from then Prime Minister Stephen Harper asking me, well, would you like to sit in the Senate, considering that there's a seat open in Quebec and you're from Quebec and I kind of like you. And so I said, yes, I'd like to sit in the Senate. And I'll tell you why I said I decided that I would sit in the Senate. I was a national chief trying to make changes for Canada's off-reserve population as best as I could. And it was difficult because it was always having to fight and negotiate with not only the federal government, but also the provincial governments. So it was very difficult. So I saw this opportunity, being asked to sit in the Senate. Well, I'm going to be right there in the game, part of the game, and being there to instill changes with, you know, the non-Indigenous members of Parliament and whatnot. And so I was there, and you know, for people who know me, I'm kind of like, you know, I'm kind of a loyal person. I'm an honest person. Like I said, you may not like what you hear from me, but I'm blunt. I'm straightforward. And I like to argue and I like to debate. And sometimes I win, sometimes I lose. But so I was part at that time of the Conservative Party. And I was loyal. You know, I was one of 7 Indigenous representatives of that party at that time. But you know, for those who followed the career a little bit, well, at some point it started to go downhill. And it started to go downhill with the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Because even though I was part of the Conservative Party at that time, you know, we had national caucus meetings every Wednesday where all the members of Parliament of the Conservative Party with the senators all met in one room, and we had direct access to the Prime Minister. And at one point I rose, and because the Prime Minister at the time and the party at the time did not want to have an inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so in the back rooms, like talking with the Prime Minister and others, the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, for the need to have an inquiry, at every turn they shut me down. And so at one point, I brought into that caucus meeting in front of the Prime Minister, I stood at the mic, and I took out 7 or 8 volumes. And those volumes was that there was an inquiry here in BC about the missing salmon stock. So I put the volumes of books on the desk. I said, you know, salmon is important for the economy for fishermen and the like. But how can we have multi-million-dollar inquiries on missing salmon stock and have absolutely nothing for human beings? And so that kind of was the beginning of my downward spiral with the Conservative Party, because I believe, and perhaps this is just my perception, but I firmly believe that it was at that instant that I sort of broke ranks with the Conservative Party because of this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We needed to have an inquiry. Now, I'm not going to get into the issues of today's inquiry. The inquiry is there, and we'll let the people do the good work that they need to do, even though there has been some flaws and et cetera. But I don't want to talk about that today. But just to say that when you stand up contrary to a political party's vision, well, those people take great risks, because you have the political party and their power, and it's not about the individuals, it's not about doing the right thing, it's not about doing the right thing for people, it's about what the party believes, and we got to stick to that. And I'll remember, and this is being filmed by APTN in the back, the Aboriginal People's Television Network. I used to go on the panel there when I was a conservative, a member of the Conservative Party. I used to go on the panel, but with representatives of the Liberal Party and the NDP at the time. Once a week, we go debate ongoing issues. But each political party, before you go on TV to answer questions and to debate with others, they give you a piece of paper and they have written bullets of what has to be said. And this is every party, not just the Conservative Party, every party. So this is why when you see news interviews oftentimes and people debating, they'll try to repeat the same point that they make, because that comes from the political party. And at one point, I decided to back off from appearing on those panels, because I didn't believe, personally, based on principle, what I was being given by non-Indigenous people within the Conservative Party to say about and for Indigenous people. So I told them, F off. So fast forwarding, again, like I said, I started my career at a very young age. I'm still young, but I went up very high, and the sky was the limit, and everything was there, and job security, money. I had colleagues supporting, or I thought they were supporting. And then started getting into some personal problems and professional problems. And just before, because at one point I got suspended without pay from the Senate, but just before that, I used to be the vice chair of the Senate Human Rights Committee. And at that time, I wanted to introduce a study to look at the rights and benefits and the human rights of off-reserve Aboriginal peoples across this country, because it had never been done. Because the federal government, they believe that they have jurisdiction for, pardon the language, but Indians living on reserve only. And so if you live off reserve, then the federal government says, well, you're provincial jurisdiction. But I haven't seen a provincial premier anywhere that has agreed to say, oh yeah, we have jurisdiction. So it's jurisdictional wrangling between the federal and provincial governments. And so I went contrary to the Conservative Party at the time, because they wanted nothing to do with this study, because it was going to cost millions, and they didn't know how it was going to end up as a conclusion. But at that time, I did what I had to do, and I lobbied members of my committee. I was Conservative, so I lobbied members of the Liberal members in that committee to support my study. So I called, at one point, a surprise vote to have a vote on my study, and it went through. So this was in the fall of 2012. Now, something happened to me on a personal level in February of 2013, where I was suspended. And to make a long story short, here's how politics works. This is why I said it's dirty, but this is my view at that time, but it's not necessarily always dirty. But we had started this study, we had started traveling, and ironically, the last time I had a public appearance, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was about 5 years ago, and it was here in Vancouver. So this is my first public appearance, aside from a few media opportunities in the last 5 years. But again, 2012, here's this study. We started traveling. We started meeting with off-reserve Indigenous peoples across the country. Something happens to me in February of 2013 where I get suspended. And the conservative government at that time, because they were the government, decided to pull the study. Now, that study was not about me. It was about the rights and benefits and the human rights of off-reserve Indigenous peoples. But I no longer had a seat. I could no longer voice my issue with that because this study was about people, not about me. But the conservative government at that time pulled it, and nobody said anything. And here we are 5 years later, still nothing happened with that study. So that's why I said politics is dirty. It's about their own self-serving interests.
Which study are you referring to?
The off-reserve, the human rights of off-reserve Aboriginal people in Canada. So anyway, it got pulled just a few months after it got introduced. So a lot of money went into that, but no solutions, no recommendations, no nothing, absolutely nothing. And so, like I said, sometimes you rise quickly, but the tumble could be as quick, and that's what happened to me. And I taught, like I said, I mean, I can't hide that fact. If you Google my name, you'll see everything that's been in the media. But beware sometimes what you read in the media, because like I said, I went through the justice system, I went to the courts, I went through a lengthy personal case. And sometimes what the media writes is not even close to the reality that you're living in a courtroom. So if ever you have a chance to go into a courtroom, especially on criminal cases, I would invite you to do so because even I learned a lot because I was, defending myself. And like I mentioned about money and connections, well, in the last couple of years, like I said, I rose very quickly in my career, went through some tough times, and I hit rock bottom. And when I say rock bottom, it's not just my ego rock bottom. I hit rock bottom not ego-wise. It tainted my relationships with my family, with my children. By the way, I'm a father of 5, I have 2 boys and 3 girls. It ruined some of those, or it affected some of those relationships. The colleagues that I thought that I had in the Senate turned out to be, let's see, 0. I'll say maybe 1 or 2, not 0, maybe 1 or 2 out of 105. So it was tough, but I hit rock bottom. No more money. Nothing. No connections. So when people say, well, maybe he just got off because of who he is and because he's got money, and well, you know what? I had no money. I had no connections, and who cares who I was? I was just in the news for negative things. So who really was I? But I had to go through that. It was tough. And I'm not going to get into specific details about those struggles in the last couple of years, but it's not easy for anybody, whether you're a man or a woman, to be accused, one, but to be wrongly accused of something, and you can't say anything to defend yourself. Like I love to defend myself. I love to debate. I know I'm respectful, but I'm not always right. And I'll be the first to admit that. But as soon as you're accused of something in the criminal sense, well, the first thing your lawyer tells you is, don't say anything, could be used against you. Well, we know that. But it's true. I was in a position where I wanted to defend myself. I had facts, I had everything to be able to defend myself, but I couldn't. I had to shut up. And for the first time in my life, I found that difficult because my life was not under my control or in my life. It was in the control of somebody else's hands. And that's not easy. So, like I said, it was rough. I mean, I never thought that I would see the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. And at one point, I even tried to commit suicide. And not once, but twice. And I have the scars to show it. There's one here, and there's one here. The last one, which dates just under 2 years ago, it wasn't a question of being too full of myself. It wasn't a question of, it's about me. It was just, I just couldn't see my way out of this. And so I tried to slit my throat. And, I'm glad I failed, because I'm here today. But after I tried to commit suicide, I woke up, I was in a induced coma for 2 days. And when I woke up, a doctor came and just did the regular test to make sure that I was okay. And he sat on my bed for about, I'd say a good half hour. And that day marked, it was a changing time in my life, because I never thought a doctor would take that much time for a patient. And he did. He sat on the bed and just said, you know what, you're one lucky son of a bitch, because you almost didn't miss yourself. He says, don't worry, everything is going to be okay, everything is intact. But he just told me, he says, I followed you for the last couple of years in your career, and he says, you're better than that. So he directed me to the help that I needed to get on a personal level to get back on the right track, and it was tough. It wasn't easy. No substance abuse. I did it. Been there, done that. And one thing I never did, though, is look at myself as a victim, even though in the back of my head it's sort of hard not to, because I know some of the bad things that people have done to me. But, I'm not a victim, and who cares about revenge? It would be so easy to try and seek revenge on everybody that did anything nasty or did anything negative to me. And I have no regrets. Perhaps one. I was thinking about this in the last couple of days. I don't have too many regrets in life, because on the one hand, if I had regrets, then it wouldn't make me the strong person or the person that I am today. But one of the regrets that I do have is that perhaps I surrounded myself with the wrong people. And that I did. And there were people who, instead of helping me and giving me a push-up, that they would drag me down and make me feel sorry for myself, and getting into that way of thinking. And that wasn't me, but it was hard with substance abuse. But now, I'm still seek counseling because I need it, but I'm a happier, healthier, and better person. And I'd just like to give a little shout out to my spouse there, Mary Claire, who now has a master's in psychology and will be receiving her PhD in education probably before the end of this year. And so these are the types of people that we should be surrounding ourselves with, and others as well. So, my point is, I start off with saying politics is dirty, it's a game. Well, it can be, but it's important, and I'll tell you why. And I'll probably conclude on one or two points. When I got reinstated back in the Senate a little over a year ago. And at that time, I was asked to sit on some Senate committees, and at that time, I had told the Senate I wasn't ready to sit on any committees for health reasons and just for own personal reasons, because I had been such in the limelight for too long that I just wanted to lay low and just get back into my position slowly. So I didn't sit on any committees for last year, and because of the last 5 years and my career, even with the Congress for Aboriginal Peoples as National Chief, I was ready to quit on Aboriginal issues because it takes so long for things to happen. The federal government always finds excuses to delay, cost money. We have ample examples of what they do to delay instead of progress. But then when I came back, there was this piece of legislation called Bill S3, which dealt with status and registration provisions under the Indian Act. And the Trudeau government, because that's very complicated as well, I mean, it's, first of all, the Indian Act is a racist piece of legislation, and even in 2017, we still have that, but that's another story. But this particular piece of legislation, to try and explain it as best as I can, like I said, I have 5 children. Out of the 5 children, I have 4 who are First Nations. My last daughter is non-Indigenous because of the Indian Act. And the Trudeau government, at the time, when they introduced that bill, or when that bill was introduced, well, because there's so much ongoing discrimination, sex discrimination provisions that affect First Nations women under the Indian Act. And he just wanted to get rid of just a part of it. And so the bill came to the Senate made amendments that, no. If you want to eliminate sex discrimination, you do it all across the board. Get rid of it all, once and for all. So that bill went back to the House of Commons, and ironically, the Trudeau government, on June 21st, which is National Aboriginal Day, and it was their last day of sitting, I believe, or just before the summer break, but they voted against the Senate amendments so that there'd still be ongoing discrimination under the Indian Act until there'd be further consultations. And we discussed that bill last week. It was reintroduced, and so the government, the Trudeau government, said, well, we're going to get rid of sex-based discrimination, and we're going to have consultations, but we're not going to specify how long and when exactly that bill will be fully implemented so that the sex discrimination would be entirely gone. And I thought to myself, well, you know, I became a First Nation citizen in 1985 because there were amendments to the Indian Act at that time that gave us and my family status back. And it was the Mulroney government at that time said, well, we're going to introduce, it was Bill C-31 at the time, and we're going to have consultations to eliminate the other provisions. Okay, so we're going to have consultations to deal with this. So this was in 1985. Well, from 1985 until 2010, that was a consultation period, 25 years. And then the Sheriff McIver decision came out, and the federal government had to relook at the Indian Act and try to fix it again. So they did that in 2010. And it was Prime Minister Harper, and I was there saying to his face, why don't you get rid of all the sex discrimination? He says, we can't do it. No, can't do it. Okay, so another promise of consultations. Now, how far is it going to go? Another 25 years? So when this came up this week, I tried to introduce an amendment so that we would support the bill, but that there would be a time limit on those consultations and implementations of 18 months. And to make a long story short again, well, the Senate voted that down because there was fear-mongering that, well, if we introduce that amendment, it might kill the bill completely and nothing's going to happen. Well, nothing's going to happen like what? Nobody could say. Well, we might, fear-mongering from the government. Oh, well, we might have 2 million extra status Indians in this country. Okay, well, do you have the same assessment when new Canadians come to this country? I don't think so. Oh, well, we don't know what the cost will be. Well, wait a second, you don't know what the cost will be. Well, first of all, you are the one, government, regardless of political stripe or color, introduced this upon us. Now you fix it. So my message for the amendment was to try and fix it, but it didn't work out this time. So yes, politics sucks. It may suck. Politics could be dirty. Politics is a game. But I've decided that, well, if I'm not there to try and make things better the best that I can, then who will? And so Aboriginal advocacy, or advocacy in general, is important. It changes people's lives, but sometimes it takes a long time. Because there was a point in the last 5 years that I just want to give up on Aboriginal issues because I wasn't getting anywhere. I'm not one with a lot of patience. And, you know, I don't get angry or fly off the handle, but I tried different ways or different maneuvers to convince people, but it wasn't working. So I told myself, like, I'll try something different. I'll go other committees and just take a break from Aboriginal issues. But I decided otherwise. You know, committees in the Senate will be reconstituted because there's a lot more independent senators today. So it's not just Conservatives and Liberals, it's Conservatives, Liberals, and a lot of independents. So I'm going to sit on that committee again because it's important for the Aboriginal peoples of this country. And you know, like I said, I'm one lucky son of a gun to be here. I thank you. I was going to talk about, you know, boxing, but I said, yeah, that's not really important anymore. It's done and over with. But if you feel that you have to ask questions about it, please feel free. Anything, I'm fair game. If I feel I don't want to, or I shouldn't, or it's inappropriate to answer a question, I won't. And if I do, I will. I mean, I'm that open. And so I'll open up the floor. But the message, like the first speaker and the second as well, as Native people were fighters. Talk about boxing. Here's the analogy. Boxing is a lot like politics. If you're weak, you're going to get weeded out. If you're strong, you're going to have the power. But it's to find that balance between the both, because if you find too much power, at one point it'll bite you in the butt. If you're too low or too weak, same thing unfortunately will happen. So it's to find that balance. And that balance is hard to find in politics because the Senate is there, and a lot of people don't know this, but it's there to represent minorities in Canada. And I'm sitting last Thursday in the Senate introducing my amendment. I was all excited. I'm like, this is the right thing to do based on principle, but because not only based on principle, but my young daughter is affected by the decision. And I didn't want, you know, 5 or 10 years down the road, having my daughter ask me, well, why were you sitting there and you had an opportunity to do something and you didn't do it? And I went against a lot of my Indigenous colleagues in the Senate by trying to introduce this amendment because I was rocking the boat somehow. Well, so be it. It was the right thing to do. I'm going to continue rocking that boat if it makes sense. So like I said, boxing and politics is the same thing. It's about surviving. And, you know, in my professional and personal struggles, I've survived. I'm not out of the woods yet. It's a work in progress, but damn, it's great to live. It's great to wake up in the morning. It's great to have something to do, something to aim for. Everybody goes through struggles. Everybody has their own issues. It's not always easy. You know, sometimes life sucks. Life is tough. Sometimes it's bullshit. But you gotta get up and fight. Thank you. Yes.
I would like to know what it would take to get rid of the Indian Act. I know it's been fought against for many years. Everybody agrees it's a garbage piece of legislation, it's outdated. How can we take it outside of Canada and maybe go more global with it? I know that New Zealand had some success with their Aboriginals in getting some of the legislation to change there by going more international. Where are we with that?
Well, that's a very tough question, and just in answering this, I just want to make it clear that, you know, my answer will be a personal answer. Like, obviously, it's not coming from any political parties, but from my experience, everybody, I believe, or the majority of Indigenous peoples themselves believe the Indian Act must go. But I think there's a certain level of wariness as to, one, okay, if we get rid of it, is something else going to replace it? That's number one. And number two, I think that there are many First Nations leaders out there, chiefs, who believe that the funding that comes from the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, Indigenous Affairs, is because of the Indian Act. And you know, obviously that's not right, but there's certainly a little bit of fear-mongering in terms of, well, if we get rid of that act, then, you know, are we giving up rights? So there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's a difficult question to answer because, you know, obviously I'm no longer a chief, but that's what I've experienced in the many discussions I've had over the last decade at least. But to get rid of it, the only way I see it is that if there's a groundswell of support and Indigenous leadership come together to finally demand and ask for it to be repealed, because it is racist. I mean, there's no other piece of legislation against any other minority groups in Canada except for Native people, and which is, you know, the original country. But until that groundswell of support and demands are made, the status quo will prevail, unfortunately. Yes. Yes.
What exactly is the role of the Senate?
Pardon me?
What exactly is the role of the Senate?
Well, the role in the Senate is essentially the same thing as any member of Parliament, pretty much the same powers and duties and functions, except obviously members of Parliament are elected by the people, and Canada's Senate are non-elected, so we are nominated on the advice of whoever is the Prime Minister by the Governor General. And so for example, if a piece of legislation is introduced in the House of Commons, then it will go through various stages, committees, and they'll vote on that piece of legislation, and once a piece of legislation gets approved, then it comes to the Senate. And the Senate does exactly the same steps as the House of Commons do in terms of studying the piece of legislation, having witnesses come, experts, asking questions, perhaps having amendments to the piece of legislation. So it's, you know, they talk about the chamber of sober second thought. Well, sometimes it's not all that sober, but anyway, I can say, I mean, you know, we joke often about the Senate, but the Senate really and closely looks at pieces of legislation more so than the House of Commons, because House of Commons, these people are elected. I mean, it's quicker, probably more issues to deal with, but essentially, like I said, it's mostly the same powers, except that we're nominated and not elected. Yes.
Senator Brazeau.
Patrick.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I couldn't imagine what you've been through. Well, I don't agree with the number. We just see things differently on a number of levels, and I think that's important. And I think that we should always see things differently as a group of collective people, and we kind of do what's better for everyone. And so I appreciate, despite feeling very different about things, that you still stand up here and you know, come forward kind of about a personal history. And that must be tough to do. And I couldn't imagine that. And I'm also very sympathetic to kind of what you dealt with from last year, and I'm so glad that you're here in front of us. So I think it's important to disagree and still acknowledge that we're happy to see each other. So that's kind of the nice part. My next tough question is, the Senate back in 2013 had made some recommendations on Métis identity. Where are we at with those, and where do you foresee yourself being involved in bringing that back? So INAC was to follow these recommendations, and that's about where we're at. So as someone who's speaking on behalf of, I would, you know, even though we disagree, I would say you were speaking on behalf of me at that table. And I want to know where that's sitting.
Well, first off, I mean, you know, I'm not going to proclaim myself to speak on behalf of anybody unless people approach me to do so. I mean, I'm not going to wave the flag saying I speak on behalf of everybody. I don't. You know, at some points, I even had trouble speaking on behalf of myself. And so,
I agree.
But thank you for that. I mean, obviously, I mean, even Indigenous peoples will never fully agree with each other. I mean, there's too many issues, and it's just not human nature to always agree and go with the flow. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. But as long as people, even they disagree, as long as it's respectful, you know, I respect. Well, you know, I'll say this. I mean, when I used to be part of the Conservative Party, I was more like a pit bull, you know, for the party. I had a job to do, and I was loyal to the party. I did what I was asked to do. Now, was it always right? Of course it wasn't. But at least now I can see, and being an independent, you know, I don't no longer take those bullet points like I mentioned earlier. And so to answer your question, I mean, with respect to the recommendations, nobody will say it in the Senate, but I will. When it comes to Aboriginal issues, it's long, it's tedious, it's slow. There's changes in governments. At that time, you mentioned 2013 with respect to the study on Métis identity, I believe.
That was right, yeah.
So I was no longer there at that point, from February 2013
I understand.
until last year. So
And that's what I'm asking.
I have
Like,
no clue where
you're
it's at.
now, and so what are you doing that would be, of the interest to someone who's Métis?
Well, like I said,
Specifically Métis, not just non-status or.
no, specific, yes. Well, like I said, I have no clue where those recommendations went, because I wasn't in the Senate at that time. But like I said, one of the committees I will be sitting on is the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, and obviously I'm going to, I'll specifically ask that question because I don't know the answer.
I'm gonna follow up.
But in terms of representation, I think that's what you're
Yeah.
getting at. In terms of representation, I'll make no mistake about it, or make, I won't hide the fact that when I was National Chief of the Congress, I made enemies within the Aboriginal community because I wasn't part of the AFN. Well, the AFN had their mandate, and the Métis National Council had their mandate, the Congress had their mandate. I just tried to do the best that I could do for the organization. Same thing when I became senator. Well, I angered a lot of people because I was a conservative senator. It was rare. Most people, most Indigenous people who vote, they don't vote conservative. Federal elections anyway. But I was one of those. So in politics, geez, if you can't please everybody. If you can please 1 out of 2 people, that's 50%. Those are pretty darn good numbers in politics. 50%. I haven't seen a politician have 50% support in a very long time. But again, but I'm there now to get that groundswell of support because I'm there for that. So, and I can be a voice.
Do it.
And I'm
Don't let me down.
gonna try my darn best to be who I should have been in the first place.
All right, I'm holding you to it.
Well, yeah, I have a good memory as well. Bruce?
Patrick, a couple of weeks ago, we had a presentation by Tamara Starblanket. She's a lawyer, and she made the argument that what she was talking about the UN Convention on Genocide as being legislation that protects the collective rights of Aboriginal communities as a whole. And I know you have a history of pushing for human rights, but human rights in Canada really emphasize individual rights versus collective rights. So I know that you're also, I think you're also trying to implement human right ideas into amending the Indian Act and so forth. So how do you balance the individual rights of humans with the collective rights of a nation? Am I saying it right? You put me on the spot. Am I saying that argument right? Right, Tamara's argument?
Tamara's argument, I think, largely is about how, well, her title really says it all. Genocide is genocide, no matter what you call it, the whole thing. But the fact that Canada has and continues to commit genocide against Indigenous peoples. And she provided a very solid legal argument to prove why that is.
Right.
And she looks at the definitions of genocide and gives the historical context of even how genocide first came to be defined. And so, and she just has the facts and the proof to show how Canada has and continues to commit genocide against Indigenous peoples. I think that was one of her.
Yeah, but one of the things she did say, excuse my voice, is Canada takes all that UN genocide stuff, minimizes it, softens it up under human rights legislation, right? I'm sure she said that. So I guess the question, Patrick, is, aren't you a little bit worried sometimes when you push the human rights agenda, you might be weakening group rights? How do you balance that?
Well, that's a very good question and a tough question because, like you said, human rights are usually looked at upon in an individual sense. I'm not sure if the angle of the collective human rights of, I'm assuming you're talking about Indigenous people, has been actually tried. I mean, look, we just have to go back to 2008. In 2008, the only citizens in Canada who could not do or draft a human rights complaint against either their own leaders or the federal government were First Nations people in 2008. And at that time, obviously it was the Conservative government who were in power, and I was National Chief of CAP, and I was able to convince the then and late Jim Prentice, who was the Indian Affairs Minister, to have consultations across the country to eliminate and repeal Section 67 of the Canadian Human Rights Act in 2008. And so that was successful, so, you know, I've got to give credit where credit is due for the Conservatives. They did do that, and I was glad I was part of that, because it was senseless. I mean, why? In 2008, the only citizens in Canada who could not file a complaint against their own leaders or the federal government for discrimination or any issues towards human rights were First Nations people. So they were being discriminated against, and that was fixed. But on the collective part, I think it's yet to be seen. Unless I'm mistaken that it has been tried, I'm not sure, but I don't think it's been tested very, very often. But it's a good question. Thank you. Anybody else? No boxing questions? Come on, it must be a boxing question. Look, I'm the only Canadian citizen currently who punched a prime minister and didn't get charged for it. Hey, I'm lucky. I lost the fight, but I'm lucky.
I think Laura has a question.
I have a picture, no question.
Yes.
Good.
Where it is. We're gonna start. So, you remember me, Davey?
You.
So I met Senator Brazeau, yeah, Patrick, December 2012. I actually do a lot of work around the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And he knows this, because I had the opportunity to give him a tour of the downtown east side. And I explained to him what happened to my family. You know, I have a missing aunt. She's been missing since 1978, Belinda Williams. My cousin Tanya Holick went missing in 1996. Her DNA was later found on Robert Picton's farm. And my other cousin was taken by a different serial killer, Terry Arnold. She was raped by him in the mountains, but for some reason he let her go. This was a serial killer. For some reason, he let her go. My other aunt was pushed out of a window in the downtown east side. She fell about 3 or 4 stories. She survived. So when Patrick came to Vancouver, I was given the opportunity to give him a tour of the downtown east side and tell him my story. That was in 2012. You know, I've been doing a lot of work around this issue since then, and I think this is the class that
Saw your face on the screen, right? But they couldn't hear anything. But then we got you on a laptop and we went like this around, and then we heard you.
So I started a dance group, Butterflies in Spirit, who you met a few months ago, and I don't know if I explained Butterflies in Spirit to you. Yeah, so since then, we've gone international. We've actually, last summer, August, just a few months ago, we performed in Colombia, Bogota. We got asked to perform at the International Women's World Peace event. So when we did that, what I didn't expect was to meet other powerful women's groups from Colombia. So we met with so many different powerful women's groups and the national women's group out there as well. And amazing experience, amazing, and you know, creating those allies. But my heart was broken. Like, you know, because we had that talk. We were walking, and you actually told me you had a song for the missing and murdered women. And you actually asked me what you should do with it. You said, should I release it? I'm not sure if I want to. And you released it 6 days later. And so when that whole incident happened in 2013, I was like, oh my God, what's going on here? And then all the other incidents happened. And so now we're here today. Here we are. And I was coming here. I was actually feeling frustrated, but then I didn't know this other side. I didn't know. I watched your YouTube video with face to face.
And face to face.
And yeah, that's something I didn't know about. So then I'm like, okay, what's going on here? But you're in there, you're in the Senate, right? So you stood up here and you said you were not gonna get into the issue of missing and murdered women. But because you were in there before fighting for it, and you're in there now, I wanna know what you can still do and what you could tell me to do out here. Because I feel like this is such a huge issue and we need all that we can get. And I want to know what you have to say about the inquiry, because you're in there. And, you know, I just feel like it's the government that is holding the inquiry back as well. You know, they're only given 2 years. It takes like, what, 4 months to actually hire somebody, 4 to 6 months. And I hope they get that extension. Yeah, I just want to know that. So that's, I think that's one question. Is that one question? Is that a few questions?
All in one. Well, look, I remember that too. Actually, that was my last official public event. That's already 5 years ago.